Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with another update on what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about oil production. Russia is a member of OPEC+, which is the consortium of oil producers that look to control the amount of oil that enters the global markets on a daily basis. Now, OPEC Plus has not been happy over the last 18 months or so as oil prices have started to come down. And Saudi Arabia, which is the leader of OPEC, has announced a variety of cuts that OPEC Plus have decided upon to try to keep the price of oil high, because all of these countries have a vested interest in selling oil at the highest price possible, even though that's obviously not good news for the global economy. And Russia, being a member of OPEC Plus, has signed up to cut back on its production. However, I think what's really interesting is that this is coming at a time when there's a lot of pressure on the Russian oil industry. And so there is a question as to whether or not Russia is doing this as a result of being part of OPEC Plus, or if it's a reflection of production problems that are happening right now in Russia. So in today's video, we'll have a look at the latest announcement, which includes a further cut of 471,000 barrels of oil per day by Russia. And if you annualize that, that's around 172 million barrels per year that Russia is cutting back on. And at an average price currently of around $75 per barrel, that means that Russia has voluntarily agreed to cut its income by around $13 billion. But the situation is actually much worse than that, because this is the second round of cuts that Russia have announced. So in today's video, we'll have a look at the latest announcement and talk about how much oil Russia has actually agreed to cut back on in 2024. We'll then have a look at what the financial implications of that are from Russia's point of view, because this is leading to a huge loss of income. But we'll also then look at what this means for Russia's production, because it's not just the financial impact that we have to be worried about. It's also the fact that when you're dealing with oil production, if you start cutting back on the amount that you're pulling out of the ground, that can have some serious implications to the future viability of those oil production facilities. And Russia at the moment is struggling because it's more than 2 years into the sanctions, and that means that it's losing more and more access to technology and the partnerships that it had when it created all of those oil facilities. We'll then talk about what's happening with regards to the Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil production facilities. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications of these latest production cuts are for the Russian economy. And then we'll talk about what the impact of all of this is on the global economy, because the continued cutbacks by OPEC Plus to drive up oil prices is obviously bad news for everybody that needs to buy oil. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say, once again, thank you so much to everybody that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, really appreciate the time and effort that you've taken to do that. Really, really appreciate that. And if you've signed up as a patron or a member, you're providing me with long-term support that really helps to keep this channel going. So thank you so much. On Sunday the 3rd of March, OPEC Plus announced that it will continue with the voluntary oil production cuts, equating to 2.2 million barrels per day for at least the first quarter of 2024. And the biggest country involved in OPEC Plus, Saudi Arabia, confirmed that it will continue with its 1 million barrel per day cut. Now, included in this announcement was a surprise announcement by Russia that they are going to extend the amount of their production cuts by a further 471,000 barrels per day. And that's on top of the 500,000 barrels per day that Russia announced in April 2023. So in total, Russia has now agreed voluntarily to cut back its production by 971,000 barrels per day. And when that figure is annualized, it equates to more than 350 million barrels per year that Russia has agreed voluntarily not to sell into the international markets. Now, obviously, that has a number of implications from Russia's point of view. Firstly, there are the financial implications, because Russia is losing out on the sale of all of that oil at a time when it needs as much income as possible because of all the sanctions that have been applied against Russia. Secondly, there are the production issues, because when you cut back on the production of oil, it's not quite as simple as just turning the taps on and off. Once you've got an oil rig up and running and the oil is flowing, the last thing that you want to do is start meddling with the flow of that oil, because it could cause you major problems in the future when you want to turn that supply back up again. And the third issue from Russia's point of view is the implication of all of this in terms of all of the people who are employed in the oil industry in Russia. And it raises the question as to whether or not Russia is doing this because it wants to be seen as a good member of OPEC and help to keep oil prices high, or if it's doing it because there are some other problems that are now starting to appear in the oil industry in Russia. And the opportunity of announcing oil production cuts because of OPEC could represent a convenient excuse from Russia's point of view. So let's firstly have a look at the financial implications of these latest production cuts. This chart shows the top 10 oil producing countries in the world back in April 2022, which was shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022. And as you can see, at that time, the USA was the world's largest producer, producing 11.9 million barrels per day, followed by Saudi Arabia with 10.6 million barrels per day, and Russia came in third with 10.3 million barrels per day. Now, interestingly, when you compare that to the situation back in 2020, Russia was actually producing closer to 11 million barrels per day. So in the 2 years building up to the war in Ukraine, Russia had cut its production by around 800,000 barrels per day, or around 7%. If we now look at the top 10 oil producing countries in September 2023, you can see that the USA is still the largest oil producer and has actually increased its oil production from 11.9 million barrels per day to 12.9 million. As a result of the voluntary OPEC Plus production cuts, Saudi Arabia had actually lost its position as the world's second largest oil producer to Russia, who were then producing just under 9.5 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia came in at third with just over 9 million barrels, followed by Canada with an increase to 4.8 million barrels, Iraq number 5 with 4.3 million, China number 6 with 4 million, Brazil number 7 with 3.7, UAE number 8 with 3.25, Iran number 9 with 3.1, and Kuwait were number 10 with 2.6 million barrels per day. If we now take into account Russia's latest announcement that it's cutting back a further 471,000 barrels per day, that takes its total production down to around 9 million barrels per day, which equates to what Saudi Arabia are producing. Now, if we look at the financial implications of that, this chart shows the current price of Urals oil. And as you can see, it's sitting at around $75 per barrel, which I think is obviously interesting because the price cap has been set at $60 per barrel. So Russia is still managing to achieve sales that are not being caught by that price cap. Obviously, where Russia is able to use its own tankers or tankers provided by countries that are not included in the sanctions, it's able to sell that oil at a higher price, which gives it an overall average cost above the $60 per barrel limit. And if we firstly apply the $75 per barrel to the latest 471,000 barrel per day cut, that equates to total annual lost revenue of $13 billion. And if you then include the 500,000 barrel per day cut that Russia announced in April of 2023 that's still in place, that's an additional $13.7 billion per year. So in total, the voluntary cuts that Russia has announced as part of the OPEC Plus cutbacks equates to lost direct income of more than $27 billion per year. So obviously the loss of $27 billion of revenue per year is going to hurt the Russian economy. However, when you take into account that at the end of 2020, Russia was actually producing 11 million barrels of oil per day compared with 9 million barrels today, that's a loss of 2 million barrels per day. And when you annualize the impact of that in terms of total income, that's around $55 billion worth of revenue that Russia has lost over the last 4 years. And that's one of the reasons why oil and gas revenue is continuing to decline in Russia and why the Russian economy is now under pressure. As I mentioned at the start of today's video, there is now a question as to whether or not Russia is voluntarily offering these oil production cuts as part of its membership of OPEC+, or if it's using this as an excuse to cover up production problems that are now occurring in Russia. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the oil majors came out and said that they no longer wanted to have any dealings in Russia. And this was quite an important decision because BP, Shell and ExxonMobil had all been intrinsically involved in designing and developing the oil production facilities in Russia. Following the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia invited in the oil majors to come and help it develop its natural resources. And this worked really well from both sides because it enabled Russia to be able to access all of that oil that was sitting under the ground, often in really inhospitable climates, very, very cold areas of the world. So they needed the latest drilling technology and also the latest engineers to be able to cope with what was happening to make sure that those extreme temperatures didn't stop the flow of that oil. And by offering joint venture facilities, Russia was able to tap in to the world's experts. Some of the best engineers in the world flew into Russia and helped design and build those facilities. However, because of the sanctions that are now in place against Russia, Russia firstly don't have access to any of those experts. Those engineers who designed and built those facilities are no longer involved. Secondly, they don't have any access to those companies. So BP, Shell, ExxonMobil and other oil majors don't want to know when Russia does encounter problems. And thirdly, and possibly most critically of all, Russia no longer has access to cutting-edge technology. One of the main focuses of the sanctions is to cut the supply of leading chips into Russia. And that's a major problem when you've got cutting-edge facilities in some of your oil and gas production. And that's what's happened to Russia over the last 2 years. They're having to work with older and older technology. They built up a supply of chips ahead of the invasion of Ukraine. We know that from the data. However, those chips are now more than 2 years old, and also the supplies are running low. So from Russia's point of view, as and when they get wear and tear and production problems, they're now struggling to be able to fix and remedy all of those problems because firstly, they don't have the IT to be able to do it. And secondly, they don't have the leading experts in the world to call upon and ask them what to do in the event of this particular problem. And so there is a real risk here that from Russia's point of view, the reason that they're cutting back on their production and the sale of oil globally is because they're pulling less oil out of the ground because of production problems. And if that is the situation, then Russia has major problems that are now starting to build in its oil and gas facilities. And that's going to cause it further production problems in the future, will mean that it'll further have to cut back on the amount it's selling into the international markets, which will reduce its income and therefore have a huge impact on the Russian economy. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that I recently posted a video talking about the fact that Russia has now announced an outright ban for the next 6 months on the export of all gasoline. And gasoline is one of Russia's highest margin products. It makes a lot of profit on the sale of that gasoline. And the reason that it cited was because it needs that gasoline for its home market and for agriculture. But Russia is one of the world's biggest producers of oil. We saw that from the data earlier in today's video. So they should have huge amounts of gasoline. The reason that they're producing so much oil is to export it. That's what the Russian economy is built upon. So the fact that Russia has announced this outright ban on the export of gasoline indicates that there are problems with the production of oil because Russia has 44 mega refineries, and those refineries are geared up to process huge volumes of oil on a daily basis. So the fact that it doesn't have enough gasoline to be able to sell it into the international markets tells us that there are production problems happening right now in Russia, and the reasons that Russia is calling out in terms of all of these different restrictions are probably not to do with the reasons that they're actually announcing and are more to do with production issues. One of the other major problems that Russia is now encountering are drone attacks by Ukraine on its oil and gas facilities, because drones are able to travel unmanned for long distances and therefore hit facilities that are in the heart of Russia. Ukraine don't have to send any people or any fighter aircraft. They can literally just put the explosives onto a drone and then fly it for hundreds of miles to hit a facility and then cause Russia major problems. And lots of these attacks are now being reported.
A fire broke out at a Baltic Sea terminal in Russia following a suspected Ukrainian drone attack. The Ust-Luga complex is on the Gulf of Finland, about 110 miles west of St. Petersburg. The Interfax Ukraine news agency, citing unnamed sources, said the fire was the result of a special operation carried out by Ukraine's security services. Russian news outlet Shot said local residents heard a drone operating nearby, followed by several explosions.
Now, one of the most interesting things about this drone strike is the distance that the drone would have had to travel across. It's estimated that from the launch area in Ukraine, it would have had to travel more than 800 miles. And although in the summer of 2023, Ukraine announced that it had developed drones that could travel 1,000 kilometres, so around 700 miles, this latest drone strike, if it was launched from Ukraine, would be the furthest that Ukraine has successfully deployed such a mission. This footage shows 4 oil tanks at a large storage facility in the town of Klinsky, after it was reported that the Russian military brought down a Ukrainian drone. Alexander Bogomaz, the regional governor of Bryansk, posted a message on Telegram saying an aeroplane-style drone was brought down by the Defence Ministry using radio-electronic means. When the aerial target was destroyed, its munitions were dropped on the territory of the Klinsky oil depot. It was reported that several Ukrainian drones struck facilities at a fuel and energy complex in Russia's Oryol region. A Ukrainian kamikaze drone allegedly hit the Orineft product oil depot, and another drone struck the building of a local energy provider. In addition to this attack, explosions were reported at an oil depot on the outskirts of the Russian city of Nizhny Tagil, and a fire erupted at a substation in Moscow, causing electricity and heating outages in dozens of multi-storey buildings. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because the production of oil is one of the biggest issues facing the Russian economy. It needs to produce large volumes of oil to be able to export it, to earn money, to keep the economy moving. The majority of countries in Europe, the USA, Canada, and various other countries around the world are no longer buying Russian oil and gas. And obviously that's had a big financial impact on the Russian economy. But one of the other things that is now starting to hurt Russia is the restriction of technology and the supply of information and software. Russia's access to all of those things was removed following its invasion of Ukraine, and we are now starting to see the gradual breakdown of Russia's oil and gas production facilities. And I think it's really interesting the way Russia is presenting this to the rest of the world. We first saw an oil production cut back in April of 2023, when Russia voluntarily agreed to cut back 500,000 barrels per day, and that was quite a surprise to the markets. However, we have now seen a further cutback of around 500,000 barrels that's going to be applied in the first quarter of 2024. So over the last year, Russia has voluntarily cut back by 1 million barrels per day. And when you're selling that oil for around $75 per barrel, that means that you're cutting your own revenue by $75 million per day. That's obviously a large amount of cash. Now, Russia at the moment needs as much cash as it can get its hands on because it's having to fund the war in Ukraine. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that I recently posted the latest figures that have been published by the Ministry of Finance in Russia, which showed that Russia, once again in January 2024, posted a net loss. And Russia is continuing to have to fund those losses from its National Wealth Fund. And when you combine the latest voluntary announcement with the announcement that it's banned the export of all gasoline products for the next 6 months, that is a serious loss of income to the Russian economy. So when you take a step back and have a think about why Russia is making these announcements, yes, it's a member of OPEC+, so it wants to be seen as doing the right thing. However, the reason that OPEC+ is cutting back on the global production is to keep the price of oil high. It wants to sell oil for as much as it can per barrel. But Russia isn't really following that philosophy because Russia is selling its oil at a discount to the rest of the market. So while Saudi Arabia and the other members of OPEC+ are selling their oil for about $90 per barrel, Russia is offering the same sort of oil for $75. So it's already undercutting OPEC Plus. So that really is counterintuitive when you think about what OPEC Plus are trying to do. They're trying to keep oil prices high, and Russia is offering its oil at a discount to all of those prices. So actually, they're undercutting the rest of OPEC Plus. So there's a slight conflict of interest when you think about it, because despite the fact that Russia is a member of OPEC Plus and is trying to keep oil prices high, it's offering everybody a discount to buy the same sort of product. So I don't think it really stacks up when you think that Russia is doing this just to be a good member of OPEC Plus. There must be some other reasons. And the most obvious reason would be that Russia is struggling to produce the same amount of oil that it was 2 or 3 years ago. As we talked about earlier in the video, in 2020, Russia produced around 11 million barrels per day. Now they're down to around 9 million barrels per day. That's a serious reduction. And one of the reasons why that production is falling so rapidly is because the facilities that Russia has are now getting older. They need to have cutting-edge technology, but Russia no longer has access to that technology or the experts or anybody who can come in and help them redesign those facilities. And that means that from Russia's point of view, there are serious concerns starting to rise about what's going to happen with its oil production facilities and the amount of oil that it's producing. And obviously, that has a direct impact to the Russian economy, because when you're constantly cutting back on the amount of oil you're producing and therefore selling, you're cutting back on your income. And over the last 2 years or so, Russia has cut back its production by around 2 million barrels per day, which is a huge amount of cash. That's over $50 billion of lost revenue every single year. And that is going to hurt the Russian economy. And as it stands at the moment, it doesn't look like there's any end in sight in terms of the war in Ukraine. And therefore, it's likely to continue going down this road. It's likely that Russia will continue to cut back on its production as it has further problems. So this is becoming a really big issue from Russia's point of view. But in terms of talking about what the impact of the OPEC Plus announcement in terms of trying to keep oil prices as high as possible, that's obviously going to have a negative impact on the global economy, because the global market for oil is a true market. It's measured by supply and demand. And so when demand starts falling, as it has over the last 12 months or so, that generally brings the price of oil down. And so oil prices should balance off to enable the economies to recover and then bounce back, and that's when oil prices go back up. But if you artificially raise oil prices, it actually makes things worse, because if you've got a slowdown in the global economy and you suddenly hike the price of oil, which is a major contributing factor in the price of everything, then that's going to make things worse, because it's going to increase inflation at a time when you need the pressure to be relieved. So the overall impact of the OPEC Plus announcement to further cut back on production is going to increase oil prices, which is going to be bad news for the global economy. So the overall summary of today's video is that obviously the OPEC Plus announcement is bad news for the global economy, but the announcement that Russia is now cutting back a further 500,000 barrels of oil per day on top of the previous reduction of 500,000 barrels announced in April 23 is obviously going to lead to a huge reduction in income from Russia's point of view, and potentially indicates that Russia is now having production problems with its oil facilities. And if that continues, it could be really, really bad news for Russia and its economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. Now here's something to put a smile on your face.